New Orleans, Louisiana. David Hart, an architect specializing in restoring old houses, and his wife Sarah, a history teacher, had just received the keys to the mansion at 1324 Willow Street, a dilapidated Gothic building abandoned since the 1980s. Just hours later, in the second-floor drawing room, David peeled back a section of crumbling plaster and found a sealed wooden box. Inside, a clump of dried hair, a broken silver comb, and a portrait of a young girl whose eyes seemed to stare directly into the viewer's soul. Then suddenly at night, slow rhythmic knocking sounds emanated from the walls, terrifying the couple and unearthing a horrifying secret hidden within the house. Before we delve deeper into the story, please let us know where you're reading from and rate this story from 1 to 10. Thank you for joining us. Let's begin. March 2005, a radiant New Orleans morning. Golden sunlight streamed onto moss-covered rooftops, filtering through the ancient oak canopies in the Garden District, carrying the pungent scent of dampness and early jasmine bloom, a captivating blend characteristic of this city. David and Sarah Hart, a middle-class couple with simple dreams, stood before the antique mansion at 1324 Willow Street. It was a Gothic revival structure with intricately wrought iron balconies, stained glass windows casting vibrant rainbows onto the steps, and a wild garden choked by weeds. An ambitious project, my love. Sarah whispered, her soft hand tightening on David's, her eyes sparkling with excitement and a hint of trepidation. Sarah Hart, 32, was a high school history teacher. Her bright, expressive eyes were always drawn to the stories hidden beneath layers of plaster, the legacies of the past. It was this passion for history that led her to this mansion, a living piece of New Orleans memory. David Hart, 35. A civil architect with a sturdy physique and the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to working with bricks and mortar, smiled reassuringly. Ambition is the driving force. You'll see this house has great potential. David was a practical, meticulous man with extensive experience in repairing and renovating old structures. He often joked that he could hear the cracks, the groans of the wood, each telling its own story. But from the moment he set foot on the property, he felt a strange stillness enveloping the house, unlike the usual quiet of abandoned buildings. They opened the rusted iron gate, its creaking echoing in the hushed air, like a greeting from the past. Inside, the space was vast and overwhelming, yet covered in a thick layer of dust, with mold clinging to the walls and cobwebs strung everywhere. David headed straight for the second-floor drawing room, believed to be the former studio of the previous owner-painter, Elias Thorne. The spacious room, with its soaring ceilings and large windows that once welcomed natural light, was a place where artistic ideas blossomed. But now, it was just a cracked, warped section of plaster on the wall. From that crack, David felt an unusual cold draft emanating even amidst the hot and humid spring morning of New Orleans. This entire section needs to be redone. David muttered, his voice dropping as he ran his hand over the plaster. He felt a hollow space behind the plaster, unusual for a load-bearing wall. He took his specialized pry knife from his toolkit and began to pry off a larger section of plaster. Bits of mortar crumbled to the floor, bringing with them dust and the smell of old dampness. When the last piece of plaster came off, a hard object struck the blade and then fell onto the wooden floor with a rustle, creating a dry sound. It was an old wooden box about the size of a brick, sealed with handmade nails from the early 20th century, nails David immediately recognized as not belonging to modern construction techniques. He picked up the box, brushing off the thick layer of dust clinging to its worn surface. Sarah approached, her curious eyes fixed on the box reflecting the dim light from the window. "What is it, dear?" she asked, her voice excited, yet a little hesitant. David gently pried open the lid, little by little. A faint scent of dust, old paper, and something dry and unfamiliar wafted out, making him frown. Inside, wrapped in a piece of silk discolored by time, was a clump of withered hair wrapped around a broken silver comb and a charcoal portrait of a young girl. The eyes in the drawing were large, jet black, staring directly at the viewer with an unsettling, haunting intensity. They weren't the eyes of a passive model, but those of a suffering soul watching. On the back of the portrait, a faint, almost faded inscription in ink read, "Beauty must be preserved. She will never leave." Sarah picked up the portrait, a shiver running down her spine. Those eyes, they look so alive. It's unsettling. She felt an unexpected cold draft on her face as she held the drawing like an invisible breath from the past. David turned to look at the gaping hole in the wall where the plaster had been removed. He noticed a small but significant anomaly. A section of bricks where the box was hidden, though covered with mortar, appeared to be laid inconsistently with the rest of the wall. A deliberate concealment, a scar on the architectural body. David and Sarah left the mansion as the sun began to set, taking the box and the portrait with them, along with unanswered questions. They decided to spend their first night in a nearby rented apartment to rest after a long day. But peace did not come. That night, Epister, 17 a.m. David woke with a start. A strange dry sound echoed from the direction of the mansion. Tap, tap, tap. He held his breath, eyes wide in the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking repeated steadily, relentlessly, like an obsessive rhythm. It wasn't the usual creaking of old houses, nor the scurrying of rats. It possessed an eerie deliberateness, a terrifying intent. Sarah was also awake, her trembling hand gripping his, her breath shallow. "Do you hear that from the mansion?" David nodded, his voice a rasp. "Loud and clear. It sounds like someone is knocking from inside the wall." He turned on the bedside lamp, its dim light illuminating the room. They both stared into the invisible darkness beyond the window, where the mansion loomed in the night. The knocking continued steadily without pause, like a plea or a warning. Both David and Sarah felt a chill run down their spines from the unsettling sound. All that night, David and Sarah couldn't sleep a wink. The knocking echoed in their minds, intertwined with the image of the haunting eyes in the portrait and the chilling inscription, "She will never leave." The next morning, as the first rays of sun pierced through the curtains, David immediately went into the drawing room. The room was still eerily quiet. The section of wall he had removed remained a gaping dark hole like a lifeless eye staring into the past. He re-examined the wall, tapping a few spots. The knocking from the night before had ceased, but the sense of unease lingered, swirling in the air. "I'll check it more thoroughly later," he told Sarah, his expression thoughtful. "There's a large hollow space behind there in that cold draft. It's not a natural draft. It's like some old ventilation system, very deep." David took out his stethoscope, pressed it against the wall, listening intently. There was only the echo of the empty space, nothing but the thumping of his own heart. Sarah, intensely drawn to the portrait and the strange inscription, couldn't wait any longer. She knew she needed to learn about the house's previous owner. She decided to begin her work immediately. She went to the New Orleans Public Library, a place filled with old documents. She began searching for information on Elias Thorne, the painter, the former owner of 1324 Willow Street. The file on Elias Thorne wasn't very thick, but it was filled with peculiar details. Elias Thorne, Born in 1920, a talented but notoriously eccentric artist, reclusive, and rarely appearing in public. Old articles described him as a solitary genius obsessed with beauty and eternity. Sarah found old art reviews. Thorne had reached the peak of his career in the 1960s with his vibrant, surrealist paintings, often exhibited in small galleries in France and New York. Those works were dazzling, full of life. But then, his style abruptly changed. From the mid-1970s onwards, his paintings became darker, more haunting, with cold hues and distorted images. She found the first clue about Lillian Lily Dubois. A small Society article from July 1970, tucked away in the local news section, mentioned the sudden disappearance of Thorne's talented young model, Lillian Dubois. Police had only recorded it as a voluntary disappearance, with no signs of violence found. But an unofficial biography of Thorne, which she found in the library's special archives, a little-known book contained a chilling detail, a letter to Lily's friends, in which she expressed her fear that Elias Thorne was too controlling and frightening, obsessed with beauty to the point of madness, en banc io, and that she had to leave him before it was too late. The letter ended with a desperate line, "He wouldn't let me go." Thorne's subsequent works, which Sarah found in old exhibition catalogs, clearly reflected this obsession. Lily's lily symbol, chained and withered in glass cages, pleading eyes gazing from lifeless still life scenes, and faint images of young girls imprisoned within crypt-like structures, hidden within the complex details of the paintings, requiring keen observation to discern. And then Sarah found even more disturbing notes located in an old file on closed orphanages. From around 1980, Elias Thorne began adopting 3 orphaned girls from impoverished rural Louisiana orphanages. The records only listed their names as Alice, 9 years old, Bethany, 8 years old, and Catherine, 9 years old. The papers showed Thorne's commitment to giving them a better life, training them to be cultured women of dignity. But just 2 years later, around 1982-1983, Alice, Bethany, and Catherine also disappeared without a trace. Police records consistently concluded the same as Lily's case: runaway or sent to distant relatives, with no clear evidence. Sarah felt a chill, a cold sensation running down her spine, not from the air conditioning, but from the growing horror in her mind. 4 women disappeared. 3 of them were children, all connected to Elias Thorne and his house. It couldn't be a coincidence. She photographed all the documents with her phone, hurrying back home. As she entered, David was sitting on the floor of the drawing room, his face pensive, a small hammer in his hand, his eyes fixed on the removed wall section. He didn't hear her come in. "Find anything, dear?" Sarah asked, her voice slightly shaky, trying to calm herself. David put down the hammer, looked at her, his eyes heavy with thought. "There's a large hollow space behind this wall, deeper than I thought. And that cold draft, it's not a natural draft. It's like some old ventilation system still active. I think it connects to a larger space." He tapped the wall 3 times. The knocking sound was dry, hollow. "And Sarah," David said softly, narrowing his eyes, looking straight at her. "That knocking, it's repeating meaningfully. I don't think it's the old house. It's a signal." Sarah handed David the stack of documents, recounting what she had found. They looked at each other, fear mingling with a strange determination. The entire room seemed enveloped in a heavy atmosphere, as if the knocking from the night before still lingered in the space. David placed his hand on the cold wall, feeling the faint rhythm of the knocking that only he could clearly perceive emanating from within. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes alight with a decisive resolve. "We need to open that wall. Right now. I can't leave it anymore." David's words rang out decisively in the drawing room's quiet space. Sarah nodded. David prepared his tools, chisel, light hammer, specialized flashlight. His goal was to uncover the hidden secret without further damaging the architecture. They started from the unusually reinforced section of the wall, right behind where the wooden box was found. David carefully removed layer by layer of plaster, old bricks, following the inconsistent new and old mortar lines he had discovered. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Sarah stood beside him, anxious but unwavering, her hand tightly gripping David's. After nearly an hour of intense work, a dark black void gradually appeared. Immediately, a horrifying strong stench of organic decomposition assailed them thick in the air. Sarah gagged violently, running out coughing convulsively. David also grimaced, having to cover his nose with a dust-covered cloth, his stomach churning. He switched on his specialized flashlight and shone it inside. The light pierced through the dust, slowly revealing the scene. David almost held his breath. Inside that cramped, dark space were 3 small skeletal figures of young girls, around 8-10 years old. They lay curled up, piled on top of each other, in clothes that had rotted away, mostly just threads clinging to bone. Around them were a few old toys, a tattered rag doll, a faded wooden building block. David's heart pounded. He trembled as he shone the light on one skeleton. On a tiny bone-white hand, still clutched, was a faded, very old, almost disintegrated piece of fabric embroidered with a lily flower. It was identical to the haunting images in Thorne's paintings that Sarah had found. "Oh my God," David whispered, his voice cracking. He turned to Sarah, who was leaning against the doorframe, her face pale, her eyes still fixed on the horrifying sight. "Sarah, I found them. Alice, Bethany, Catherine." The police were called immediately. The Garden District mansion quickly became a crime scene. Detectives, forensic experts, and later the media swarmed the property. The case of the mad artist and the plaster crypt instantly exploded across headlines shocking New Orleans and the nation. The image of the stately mansion, once a symbol of elegance, now became a symbol of horrific crime. Amidst all the chaos, the 3 tap knocking from the wall continued even clearer and more urgent after the first opening was made. A young investigator, Detective Miller, who was in charge of the case, also heard it. He stared at the wall, his expression a mix of skepticism and fear. "What is that? Could it be a ghost?" he mumbled, half joking, half serious. David and Sarah looked at each other, fear mingled with a strange premonition. The haunting question echoed in their minds. If the children were dead, then who was knocking? Just then, Detective Miller received an urgent call. His face suddenly changed from confusion to extreme horror. "No way," he whispered. "The age of the skeletons. They just got the preliminary results." His face was ashen, as if he had just seen a ghost. He stared at David, his eyes filled with disbelief and horror. The cell phone was still pressed tightly to his ear, but the words from the other end seemed to have frozen every thought in his head. David and Sarah felt their hearts clench. A heavy silence enveloped the drawing room, the atmosphere taut with only the constant flashing of forensic cameras echoing from behind. They waited in anxious suspense, the feeling of dread seeping into every fiber of their being. According to the initial radiocarbon dating, these skeletons date back to roughly the 1920s to 1930s. Miller said, almost disbelieving his own words. He lowered the phone, looking at David and Sarah with a hopeless gaze. Meaning, long before Elias Thorne bought this house. More than 30 years. The air in the room seemed to solidify. David and Sarah looked at each other, their shock evident in their eyes. All their hypotheses about Alice, Bethany, and Catherine crumbled, shattering like glass. A chill ran down their spines, not from the temperature, but from the terrible truth that had just been revealed. This house contained not one, but two horrifying secrets, separated by a generation, two layers of crime hidden within the same wall. So, who were they? Sarah asked, her voice weak, feeling an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. We don't know. Miller shook his head, his face full of helplessness. He rubbed his forehead, trying to process the information. City records show no reported child disappearances in this area during that time. It seems they were victims of a crime or tragedy, hidden from a very distant historical period of the house itself. Sarah, being a history teacher, began to dig through her knowledge. New Orleans in the 20s and 30s. That was the Great Depression era. Many poor families, homeless children wandering everywhere. Many disappeared without a trace. She thought to herself, could those skeletons be part of a forgotten social tragedy? While Miller continued to contact the forensic team, seeking more information about the skeletons, Sarah turned to the embroidered lily cloth. Textile experts had confirmed it was a type of fabric and embroidery technique common in the 1960s, 1970s, matching the period Thorne began painting Lily. Sarah immediately proposed a new hypothesis, telling David, her voice soft but certain, Elias Thorne might have discovered these skeletons when he began renovating the house around 1960. That discovery obsessed him, combined with Lily's disappearance, and drove him to believe that beauty must be preserved through imprisonment. He then took Lily's embroidered cloth and placed it there as a way to link his obsession with the long-dead souls. She imagined Thorne with his sick mind touching those tiny skeletons and a crazy idea sparking in his head. Miller, after hearing Sarah's theory, nodded, though still skeptical. An interesting theory, Teacher Hart. It explains his obsession. But what about the knocking? If those children died decades ago and Thorne died in '85, then who was knocking? He looked at David, his eyes still holding a hint of doubt. That question echoed in the air again, and just then tapped 3 times. The knocking sounded again, clear and persistent, from deep within the drawing room wall where the first secret space was found. It wasn't an echo, but a new, insistent, haunting rhythm. Miller jumped, his face turning pale, his eyes fixed on the wall, his lips moving soundlessly. David and Sarah looked at each other, fear mingling with a strange premonition, an irresistible urge. That knocking was a challenge, a riddle they were compelled to solve, not a ghost. David said softly, his voice more certain than ever, as if reassuring himself. This is a signal. Someone is trying to communicate. And I think they're not where we just found them. He recalled the persistent cold draft and the feeling of an underground ventilation system he had noticed. David stared at the wall, his eyes gleaming with understanding, as if he had just seen a hidden blueprint in the air. His face hardened, intense concentration evident. He turned to Sarah, a surge of determination in his eyes. Sarah, do you remember those strange drawings of Thorne's you found? The ones about duct systems and sealed chambers? He pulled out his phone quickly, scrolling through folders, and a tangled sketch by Thorne appeared on the small screen, cluttered with symbols and incomprehensible lines. I think we just overlooked a critically important detail. That knocking, it's not coming from here. It's coming from somewhere else. David said, his voice full of conviction, his eyes fixed on Thorne's tangled sketch on his phone screen. Detective Miller remained skeptical, but David's confidence and serious demeanor commanded his attention. Sarah immediately recalled the strange handwritten drawings by Thorne she had found in his personal documents at the library. They were filled with diagrams of air duct systems, sealed chambers, and air filters that did not appear on any official architectural blueprints of the house. This indicated he had secretly built a complex system himself beyond what a normal house would have. A scrawled note on one of the drawings read, "Beauty must be purified in darkness, breathing through the conduits of eternity." David, with those strange drawings in hand, began a new search in the drawing room. He believed the knocking was not random, but a signal of life from a more deeply hidden space. He patiently walked along the walls, tapping gently, and listening to every echo, probing every old vent, every abandoned water pipe. He focused on the areas with the unusual cold draft he had felt from the beginning, where Thorne might have created a circulation system. "Be careful and notify us if you find anything new. I'll go back to the police station to see if I can find any more new documents. This is terrifying," Miller said, lowering his eyes and gesturing for his teams to collect their gear and leave. David and Sarah returned to the room and meticulously re-examined every drawing and the tangled map. And then, 10 days passed one afternoon while checking a vent obscured by an old dusty bookshelf and thick cobwebs. David felt a cold breeze much stronger than elsewhere, along with a faint metallic smell. He shone his flashlight inside and inserted an endoscope camera, a common construction tool for inspecting pipes and crevices deep into the opening. The camera screen on David's phone showed a blurry image, then gradually became clear. David held his breath. He saw a spacious sealed chamber, not a typical pipe or void. There were signs of life: an old bowl, a crumpled piece of cloth, a few small water stains. And then he saw something move, a blurry shadow, a gaunt skeletal hand. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking intensified, clearer and more desperate, seeming to come directly from inside that sealed chamber. It was no longer a whisper, but a haunting plea for help. "Sarah, come here, quick." David called, his voice, hoarse eyes glued to the screen, unable to look away. He felt his chest tighten, a mixture of fear and hope. Sarah ran over, looked at the screen, and blanched. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. That's a chamber. And there's someone inside." Her voice trembled uncontrollably. David, with a stronger premonition than ever, a surging sense of urgency, decided to break the final lock on that vent. He used specialized tools, carefully dismantling the layers of brick and metal that sealed the entrance. A pervasive, unpleasant smell of mold and long-contained human odor, more disturbing than any before, wafted out, making the air heavy and hard to breathe. When the last metal plate sprang open, an inky black void appeared. David's dim flashlight beam shone inside. From deep within the darkness, 3 huddled, emaciated figures emerged. They did not move immediately, only stared towards the light, their eyes wide vacant and almost blind from lack of light. Their long hair was tangled and dirty, their clothes ragged, almost blending into the darkness. They were women in their early 30s, in severe states of exhaustion, dehydration, lack of light. They looked like ghosts emerging from hell. David could barely breathe. These were not skeletons. This was life. 3 souls trapped, waiting in the darkness for over 2 decades. Sarah burst into tears, her face streaming. "Oh my God. They're alive." She clapped a hand over her mouth, trying to stifle her sobs. David shakily extended a hand, but dared not touch them. He knew they had endured something horrifying beyond human imagination. One of the three women, the weakest-looking one with faint scars on her wrists, Alice tried to move. She traced a shaky finger on the dusty floor, a drawing of a flame and a man running from it. Her vacant eyes stared straight at David like a warning, a final message of despair. David looked at the drawing, then at Sarah, a terrifying truth dawning on him. Thorn isn't dead. He gasped, his voice lost in astonishment. But then a soft click echoed from the staircase. A long shadow stretched across the wooden floor. The mansion's main door, which they had locked from the inside before starting work, was slowly creaking open, creating a black slit like an eye silently observing. David and Sarah almost stopped breathing. Someone was in the house, and that person knew they were here witnessing everything. Survival instincts surged stronger than ever. David quickly pulled Sarah back his hand, instinctively reaching for the nearest crowbar, gripping it tightly. The three women trapped in the hidden chamber were still staring towards the light, their eyes vacant but filled with fear. They had sensed the presence of their captor. From the slightly open door, an old chilling eye scanned them like a lightning bolt cutting through the darkness. It was the eye of a predator. David's flashlight beam glinted off a wide-brimmed hat the person was wearing, a haunting image from Alice's drawing. The man wearing a hat. Alice's drawing flashed in David's mind, a chilling confirmation. Not a word, not a sound was uttered. The door slowly closed again, returning the space to a terrifying silence. Only the pounding of David's and Sarah's hearts filled the heavy air. The person had left. Or were they hiding, watching their every move? David quickly ran to the main door. It was locked again from the outside. He had locked them inside their own house. Damn it! David growled, his face taut with extreme tension. Call the police right now. David urged Sarah, his voice urgent. As he spoke, he wrapped a piece of cloth around the crowbar's handle, preparing to confront whatever came. The three women in the chamber began to cower, faint whimpers escaping their dry throats. The haunting scent, the scent of their captor, had made them tremble. Sarah's call to the police was frantic, mixed with choked sobs. Lieutenant Miller, who was still bewildered by the skeleton case, received the report, his face instantly changing. He dispatched a special operations team to the mansion. When they arrived, breaking down the door, David had thoroughly checked every corner, but found no one. The person had vanished like a ghost, leaving no clear traces. He has to be Elias Thorn. David stated to Miller, his breath still ragged. Alice drew him. He's alive. And he came back to check on his artwork. The three women were rescued and immediately taken to the hospital. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly. Their identities were confirmed through fingerprints and old orphanage records. Alice, 30 years old, Bethany, 29 years old, Catherine, 30 years old. Their condition was extremely serious: physical exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition, severe muscle atrophy, and especially severe vocal cord damage due to not speaking for too long. Alice, who showed the clearest signs of interaction, could only occasionally produce hoarse sounds and vague drawings, but what she drew held significant meaning. Miller immediately reopened Elias Thorn's death file from 1985. They found many irregularities that had been previously overlooked: a perfunctory fire report, incomplete dental forensics, and the vague, unreliable testimony of the sole witness, an elderly and confused neighbor. Thorn had staged his death, a brilliant plan to disappear from all pursuit, living in seclusion for 20 years, while his artwork remained imprisoned in darkness. The manhunt for Elias Thorn officially began with FBI assistance. The entire city of New Orleans was shaken not only by the mansion's horrifying secret, but also by the truth that the perpetrator was still alive free for 2 decades. David and Sarah, from ordinary home buyers, became the most important witnesses in one of the city's strangest cases. While Alice was being treated, a nurse discovered a faint small tattoo on her wrist beneath an old scar, a strange symbol resembling a stylized Roman numeral. David, I think I've seen this symbol somewhere before. Detective Miller exclaimed, his eyes fixed on the photo of the faint tattoo on Alice's wrist. It was a strange symbol resembling a stylized, highly intricate Roman numeral, almost an ancient emblem. The police had checked Bethany and Catherine. They also had similar symbols, though slightly different in shape, but clearly part of the same system. They didn't look like ordinary tattoos, but rather as if they had been carved or acid-etched long ago, deeply embedded in their flesh. Where have you seen it? Sarah pressed her voice, filled with anticipation, sensing an important clue emerging. Miller pondered, scratching his chin. In some of Thorne's personal notes that we recovered from his studio after the '85 fire. I vaguely remember similar symbols. He used them to mark his artworks or his morbid ideas. Immediately, David, Sarah, and Miller returned to the scene. The mansion at 1324 Willow Street. Although thoroughly sealed, they had access as witnesses and expert consultants. David, with his experience in architectural restoration, began to re-examine the entire drawing room, especially the wall sections and floor, where Thorne had worked looking for any overlooked anomalies. Sarah sifted through the sketchbooks and the draft drawings that the police had collected, but not thoroughly analyzed, trying to find any minute detail. And then they found it. In an old sketchbook wedged under a stack of rotting floorboards where David had pried them open, he discovered a specially marked page. The page contained a series of symbols similar to the tattoos on the girl's wrists, accompanied by Thorne's tiny, handwritten notes. David pointed to them one symbol at a time. "This is Alice," he said, pointing to the first symbol. The accompanying text, "Specimen A, the purest, has reached the threshold of purification. Ready for the next phase. This is Bethany." He continued, pointing to the second symbol. The note, "Specimen B, needs more time. Weak resistance, but still potential." And the last symbol, "This is Catherine." With the accompanying text, "Specimen C, completed. Date assigned." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling. Specimens, he treated them like artworks or morbid experiments. David nodded, his face hardened with indignation. Exactly. And this, he pointed to another symbol resembling the Roman numeral IV, but meticulously drawn with the inscription, "Specimen Refer, final resting place of imperfect works. Time, 1930s. David looked up at Miller. "These are the first skeletons we found. Thorne found them, became obsessed, and made them part of his sick system. He didn't just imprison them, he marked them like a mad collector." Miller photographed the notes with his phone. "This is direct evidence that Thorne not only abducted, but also turned these girls into experimental subjects. These symbols are part of his twisted system." Miller's face was filled with determination. Along with these symbols and notes, there was a detailed diagram of the hidden chamber, with arrows pointing to different locations in the house. A small but crucial detail, hidden in the bottom corner of the page, a stylized lily symbol accompanied by the letter L, and an arrow pointing towards the back garden near an abandoned well. "Lily," Sarah murmured, her eyes wide with shock. "He hid Lily there. What did he do to her?" David immediately remembered the unusual cold draft from the well that he had felt since his first days in the house. He, Miller, and Sarah ran towards the old well. It was a dried-up stone well covered in weeds. David used his inspection equipment, an endoscope camera, a high-powered flashlight. He discovered a very small vent near the well's mouth, skillfully concealed by a perfectly camouflaged small stone slab. And from it, a faint air duct leading deep underground, exactly like what he had drawn. "There's another chamber down here." David affirmed, his voice firm, his eyes gleaming with a ray of hope. "And I think we're about to find another victim." As David and Miller tried to open the stone slab concealing the entrance, a creaking sound echoed. Below was a pitch-black cold void, and from it a faint, delicate scent of lilies, but mixed with the smell of decay, a repulsive odor of preserved putrefaction wafted up. Miller turned to look at David, his eyes wide with horror, his hand covering his nose. "This smell. It's not the smell of living flowers. It's the smell of an embalmed body." Without hesitation, the forensic team and police were dispatched to the well within minutes. David and they carefully widened the well's opening, heavy stone slabs being lifted. Below was not water, but a small tunnel leading down to a cold, damp underground stone chamber, a surprisingly solid and secret structure. Inside the chamber, the flashlight beam illuminated a bizarre sight that stunned all witnesses: a glass coffin placed solemnly on a stone pedestal, surrounded by withered brown lilies that still retained their shape. Inside the coffin lay the horrifically preserved body of a young woman, her face still delicate, but her skin withered and shriveled like a mummy. Her clothes were a faded white dress, old but intact. "Lily," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. She recognized her instantly from the facial features despite the disfigurement. It was Lillian Dubois Thorne's model and love, who had disappeared 35 years prior. Thorne hadn't killed her. He had embalmed her, hiding her in a personal mausoleum to preserve beauty, eternally, literally fulfilling the haunting statement on the portrait. Clear and horrifying proof of his madness and obsession. A small diary fragment was found inside the glass coffin, handwritten by Thorne. The ink faded, but still legible. "Lily will never leave. She will forever be my Lily, pure and immortal. My greatest masterpiece." With this undeniable evidence, the manhunt for Elias Thorne became the top priority for the entire New Orleans police force and the FBI. A nationwide warrant was issued, accompanied by warnings about his dangerousness and depravity. Police began to scour every place that might be connected to Thorne: old galleries, former rented addresses, even his sparse financial records, searching for any trace. Sarah, driven by intense indignation and a desire for justice for the suffering victims, continued to delve into Thorne's final works and notes seized by the police. She discovered a series of untitled, unfinished paintings with very small, almost indiscernible details repeating architectural lines of another house, a simpler rural home. It didn't appear to be a major artwork, but rather a hiding place. A small sketch torn at one corner seemed to be a map of a small area with a point marked with Thorne's symbol and the inscription, "The final refuge of purity, where the flower blooms eternally." David, with the eye of an architect, recognized those architectural details. He and Sarah used old maps of Louisiana, cross-referencing topographical details, rivers, forests, little-known trails. They pinpointed a small, remote town by the Mississippi River, a few hours' drive from New Orleans, where Thorne once had a small inheritance from a distant relative. The town was named Willow Creek, an eerie coincidence with Lillian's nickname, Lily. "He's there," David affirmed, pointing to the map, his eyes resolute. He staged his death and fled back here living in seclusion, probably still observing or haunted by his artworks and other flowers. The police, under Miller's direction, assembled an elite special operations team and headed to Willow Creek. The hunt for Elias Thorne, who had evaded justice for 20 years, was reaching its conclusion. Helicopters began circling overhead, police sirens tearing through the night. As the special operations team surrounded the dilapidated, abandoned house in Willow Creek, where the map indicated a small flashlight gleamed from a second-story window, flickering like an eye watching. An old raspy voice echoed from within, not panicked or fearful, but with a terrifying calm, almost a welcome, "I have been waiting for you. I have been waiting for you." Elias Thorne's old raspy voice echoed in the silent night of Willow Creek, cutting through the cold air of the desolate forest. The special operations team surrounded the dilapidated house, searchlights from police cars illuminating the area, transforming it into a macabre stage. David and Detective Miller stood at the front line, adrenaline coursing through their veins, ready for anything. Thorne offered no resistance. He opened the door, stepped out with a calm, almost patient smile, a strange acceptance. He was old, gaunt, with white hair and sunken eyes, but his gaze still held a flickering, mad obsession, like the last sparks from a dying fire. He wore an old, wide-brimmed hat, just like in Alice's drawing, the hat that had hidden him from the world for 2 decades. "Welcome to my sanctuary," Thorne said, his voice even without a hint of fear. "My work, it is perhaps complete." He was arrested without a single shot fired, without a word of protest. The interrogation room at the Willow Creek Police Department was bathed in a cold yellow light, like one of Thorne's own somber paintings. David was permitted to participate in the interrogation as an expert consultant, sitting opposite Thorne. Elias Thorne sat there, neither agitated nor angry, just a terrifying stillness. He showed no remorse or guilt. His eyes seemed to gaze through the wall into another world. "We found Alice, Bethany, Catherine," David said, his voice restrained, trying to remain calm in the face of Thorne's impassive expression. "They're alive." Thorne offered a faint smile, his eyes distant, as if looking at a faraway painting, a beautiful memory of his own. "Oh, so they have been released. I protected them very well during those 20 years. Their purity was not tainted by the outside world." He spoke as if discussing inanimate artworks, lifeless objects he had preserved. "My system worked perfectly. I kept beauty from ever fading." David placed Lily's portrait and a picture of her glass coffin on the table. "And Lily. She was found too. She wasn't an artwork, Thorne. She was a human being." Thorne gently stroked the portrait with his bony finger. "Ah, my Lily, the first Lily. She didn't understand. She wanted to leave, but beauty must be kept forever. I granted her eternity." His voice was gentle, almost loving, a warped and morbid love that had crossed the line into madness. Miller presented an old file, placing it before Thorne. "We found notes about your childhood, Elias. Your drawings from when you were a child. They always depicted children locked in cages, imprisoned flowers. How did your family treat you?" Elias Thorne looked at the file, his eyes suddenly growing sharper, colder. "Family. They didn't understand beauty. They only saw filth. My mother, she called me a tainted child, a rotten soul, because I liked drawing things she called grotesque. She locked me in the dark cellar when I disobeyed, saying it was to purify my soul." Thorne's voice grew quieter, like a painful whisper from the past. "That's where I learned that true beauty needs to be protected from the ugliness of the world." Then there was the death of your younger sister Evelyn when you were 12. Miller continued, his tone measured. She died of illness, but you said she was tainted and needed to preserve her final pure beauty. Thorne nodded. Evelyn. She was so beautiful, but illness was destroying her. I wanted to capture that moment. I drew her every day until she stopped breathing. I wished I could preserve her forever. That was his first loss, his first obsession with preservation. And then Lillian, David said, looking directly into Thorne's eyes. She just wanted to escape you. You turned your fear into imprisonment. Thorne gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. She will never leave. I found those other angels in the wall of the first house. They had been dead for a long time, but still intact. That was a wonderful inspiration. Immortality. I decided that beauty should not be buried in the ground. It must be preserved. And those girls, Alice, Bethany, Catherine, they were my living artworks. Thorne recounted in chilling, emotionless detail how he had staged the fire in 1985, using an anonymous body he had prepared beforehand to fake his death. Then secretly moved the three girls, Alice, Bethany, and Catherine, from the New Orleans chamber to the new, more meticulously prepared chamber in Willow Creek. He installed an automatic liquid food and air supply system, only occasionally visiting to check on them and observe the development of his artwork. He regarded them as flowers in an exclusive greenhouse with no right to wither or leave. The knocking? What was that? David asked, trying to comprehend this sick motivation. Ah, the knocking. Thorne smiled faintly, a chilling smile. That was how they spoke. At first they screamed I didn't like the noise. Then I taught them a new language. 3 taps. To signal their needs. Or simply to whisper to me. I wanted them to still be able to communicate with their artist. He spoke of his complete control obsessively, like a teacher instructing his pupils. Thorne showed no remorse. He believed he was a savior of beauty, an artist who had granted immortality to those society had forgotten those he had purified from decay. He was not a serial killer. He was a morbid preservationist, distorted by his haunting childhood and loss. The interrogation ended. Elias Thorne was taken away. David and Sarah left the police station, breathing a sigh of relief, but with heavy hearts. After the haunting interrogation, Elias Thorne was taken from the Willow Creek police station. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, transferred to a high-security psychiatric hospital, where he could continue to live with his morbid beliefs, considering himself an artist who had reached the highest realm of preserving beauty. Forever separated from the world he had tried to distort. The body of Lillian Dubois, Lily Thorne's first love and fatal obsession, was returned to her hometown, properly buried next to her family, after decades of imprisonment in the glass mausoleum. Her story became a painful warning about obsession, toxic control, and the tragedies it can cause. The 3 anonymous girls' skeletons from the 1920s, 1930s, the initial victims of the old mansion, and a morbid inspiration for Thorne, were also interred in a local cemetery. This served as a memorial to the nameless souls forgotten in the city's dark history. David and Sarah frequently visited that humble collective grave, bringing white lilies, a symbol of innocence, tainted and now set free. Alice, Bethany, and Catherine were embarking on the longest and most difficult journey of their lives, the journey of recovery. After 20 years imprisoned in darkness, the outside world was a great shock to them. Alice, the most resilient, though still having difficulty speaking her vocal cords, severely damaged from prolonged disuse, had learned to communicate through gestures and simple drawings. She drew extensively, no longer scary images, but flowers, bright landscapes she imagined reflecting a soul rediscovering the beauty of life. Bethany, more fragile, was initially terrified of light and open spaces. She struggled with severe anxiety and depression, frequently experiencing nightmares. But over time, with the patience of doctors, the continuous support of Alice and Catherine, and intensive psychological therapy sessions, she gradually found parts of herself again, learning to trust the outside world. Catherine, the least interactive at first, gradually showed a special passion for music. She was captivated by simple melodies and often sat for hours listening to the radio, sometimes humming notes that no one could understand, as a way to self-heal her soul through sound. David and Sarah sold the mansion at 1324 Willow Street. Although the case had brought them terrifying, haunting experiences, it also bonded them more deeply, helping them realize the true meaning of restoration was not just about old walls, but also about wounded souls. The money from the sale of the house, after necessary expenses, was partly donated to centers supporting victims of violence and missing children, places David and Sarah had researched thoroughly. David continued his work as an architect, but now he was more interested in designing safe spaces filled with light and hope for those who were hurting. Sarah remained a history teacher, but she added to her lectures stories of human resilience, of buried secrets, and the importance of never forgetting them so that the voices of the past would never fade. Many years passed. Alice, Bethany, and Catherine gradually reintegrated into society. This process was far from easy and left permanent scars on their souls, but they had new lives, found freedom, and had loved ones around them. They never completely forgot the past, but they learned to live with it, transforming pain into strength. One evening, David and Sarah were sitting reading in their new home, a modern house filled with natural light and laughter, a complete contrast to the old mansion. They were enjoying the peace and warmth they had found. Suddenly, from somewhere in the house, a sound echoed, tap, tap, tap. David and Sarah looked at each other, their hearts stopping for a brief moment. It wasn't the haunting knocking from the old wall. This time it was a knock at the door. They looked out the window and saw Alice standing there, a radiant smile on her face, gently tapping on the wooden door frame. Beside her were Bethany and Catherine, all three holding a bouquet of pure white lilies flowers, symbolizing purity set free. David and Sarah smiled. The knocking from the past, once a signal of despair and horror, had now transformed into a knock of hope, of new life, and of souls finally set free. If this story made you pause for a moment to listen, to feel, or simply to breathe a little slower, please send it to a friend via WhatsApp. Perhaps somewhere someone is looking for a piece of their past. Perhaps somewhere someone once thought they were forgotten. Or perhaps they just need to be reminded that some pains are not in vain if we dare to face them. We cannot bring anyone back to the past. But together we can tell the story so that no one has to disappear in silence. Please send this story to someone. Perhaps somewhere someone needs it at just the right time.